Hello, I'm Jeff Jowdy, your host for this special video episode of the Beacon Podcast. Today we're visiting with my good friend Jerry Lindsay, who is the Executive Partner Emeritus of Gerald Panis, Lindsay and Partners, a powerhouse firm in the field of financial resource development. And Jerry's going to be sharing his thoughts on charitable giving in this presentation. Something funny happened on the way to the gift, and it's classic Jerry, and I know you're going to learn from it and have a great time along the way. Jerry, welcome. It's great to have you back on the Beacon Podcast.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to be with you today.
We are just thrilled. I can't wait to see this presentation. For our listeners, Jerry has nearly 50 years or 50 years plus experience as a senior development officer in major healthcare and higher education institutions, as well as one of the nation's leading consultants in philanthropy. He's the past international chair of the Association for Healthcare Philanthropy and a contributing author of the nonprofit handbook. He's the former dean of the capital campaign area for the Institute for Charitable Giving, where he remains a senior faculty member today. And while sometimes Jerry says he might be retired, you would never know it. He has many, many projects going on, continuing to make a big difference in our profession and in the nonprofit arena. So, Jerry, again, welcome to the Beacon Podcast, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to be with you today. Well, this is a sort of a turn of events for me in terms of doing presentations. And I was asked years ago why I did what I did and so on. And I said, well, you know, it doesn't really make any difference when I get up in the morning to go to work, what the weather is or the temperature is or the politics are or what the world events are. I know that when I get to work this morning, I'm going to be working with a group of volunteers and staff people who are committed to making a difference with the people that they serve, whether it's children or healthcare or higher education. And so that has really been what motivated me all these years to do this. I've loved every minute of it. The other thing was I got asked that question recently, several months ago, and when I answered the question with the same answer, they asked me, well, are there things that you've experienced or clients that you've had or situations that you found a little bit humorous or a funny thing happened? And so I said, well, as a matter of fact, I don't want to bore you with them, but I said, when you get to be old in fundraising, about all you have left are the stories. So I thought, you know what? There was a movie back, I think in the 60s, about something funny happened on the way to the forum. So I just changed it to something funny happened on the way to the gift, and went through all the thousands of clients I've worked with over the years, or jobs that I've had, and I started bringing it down to a manageable number for that wouldn't take all day to tell. So when I did that, I presented it at the Institute for Charitable Giving last year and at the end of the year, and it got excellent. It got a lot of laughs, and it got a lot of nice compliments. So I decided I would do it. I had asked the people in charge that did the scheduling to put me on after the cocktail party, but they put me on in front of the cocktail party. So I really had to work at it to get people to laugh about it. So you may find some of these humors. Hopefully you'll find them at least interesting. Part of the process is I wanted to also tie in with each incident something that made it happen that was a teaching moment, or at least that I learned from the experience. So, you know, when you look at the slides that we're going to show you as well, you'll see that the first one was that we talked about was the Sandy Timberlake story. It happened, and when you see it on the slide, give some thought as to how you'll express the amount of your request. Remember, what's most important to the donors you call on: empathy, energy, and enthusiasm. Well, this is not me, and it's not Sandy, but Sandy was, we were about that age. She was my next door neighbor growing up, and we went to elementary school together and to high school together and to college together, actually. But when I was probably about 12 or 13 years old, I had a crush on Sandy in an enormous way, of course. And so I went over she lived right next door. So I went over and knocked on the door and spoke with her mother. And I said, Mrs. Timberlake, I would like very much to ask Sandy to go to the matinee with me at the local theater on Saturday afternoon. And she said, well, don't ask me, ask her. She's the one you want to go with. I'm not going with you. So she came to the door and I asked her and she consented. So you can I'll tell you how long, you can tell how long it's been, because I think, as I recall, it was a quarter apiece, and that was 50 cents. We got into the movie, we got a soft drink and a bag of popcorn, all for 50 cents for both of us. So that'll tell you how long ago that's been. So anyway, I have to say that the movie that we went to see was Love is a Many Splendored Thing. Now, if as old as I am, you'll know what that movie is. If you're not, you may not, but I recommend it to you. It starred Bill Holden and Jennifer Jones, and it's a love story. It takes place in Hong Kong during the Korean War, and it had all those elements. Well, you know, all during the movie, I kept wanting to hold her hand, and so my hand just sort of inched its way along the seat. So, but you know, still reluctant, but trying to get there. So the movie at one point has a moment where they in Hong Kong, there's when my wife and I visited Hong Kong a number of years ago, that hill does exist, and I didn't replicate the movie, but we went up she comes running up the hill, he's at the top of the hill, the music. The score, Love is a Many Splendored Thing, is a great piece of music. So if you listen to that sometime, but just as they got to the top to embrace and a great crescendo of music, and that's when I reached over and held her hand. I didn't so much as hold it as I grabbed it, and I scared the poor girl half to death. So I don't know the reason why or not, but I never went out with her again. And as we got older, we became very good friends, but we never dated, and it was my first one. So that was. The story taught me a lot. You know, make sure you plan your moves very careful before you go make the ass. So and don't just grab somebody by the collar and say you're going to give, aren't you? So sometimes you might have to do that. But anyway, so that was the beginning of when I looked at the story. So the next story I wanted to tell you about is enlightened givers feel the rapture of being alive, and we did a number of projects for Abilene Christian University, and I'll give you two stories. One is the president of the university was at that time many years ago, Dr. Royce Money, and he was just a great president. Had a great name to be president, I thought, and was a really excellent fundraiser and a leader. And so we were invited out to come to the campus in Abilene and to meet with the staff and spend the day before we were doing a feasibility study. So we did that, and we met with all the development staff. We met with the deans and the provost and the president. And the president came at 3 o'clock, which was the last hour of the meeting. And at 4 o'clock, we finished, and he walked me out to the car. They were going to take me back to the airport. And as we got by the car, he said to me, Jerry, what did you think of our team? What did you think of our staff? I said, it's clear that you have an excellent staff. They're bright, engaging people, and your program speaks to that. And he said, well, did you see anything that you think could be a problem? I said, well, Dr. Money, now sometimes I think without speaking, and this is one of those thinking, and this is one of those occasions. And I said, look, I've already said you have a great staff, but I noticed this. We prayed when we started the meeting. We prayed at lunch, and when we prayed when we adjourned the meeting. And I figure any organization has to pray that many times in a day is going to need more help than I could provide. And I thought, oh no, what's he's just looked at me. I thought he's got no sense of humor. Well, he looked at me, just seemed like 2 days, probably not more than 20, 30 seconds, still a long time. I could feel the blood draining from my face. And he looked at me, and about that time he poked his finger at me. He said, "Gotcha." And so he had a great sense of humor, and he was a great client to be with. We also had with them another circumstance that was with a children's home, not with the Abilene Christian, but it reminded me of that. That's probably, I don't think I featured it on this, but just as an aside, it was a program in Kentucky, and so they wanted to raise money for endowment. And so when I met with them, they wanted to raise $20 million. And so endowment, and they were a small organization, well run, and they had a good development officer, and they generated a good annual income. But so when I said, endowment fundraising is a little different than annual giving, and because you're looking for long-term, maybe planned gifts, of course, and estate gifts, and so you're looking at that. So I'm not sure, unless you have some people in your donor base, in your probable donor base, that are going to have that kind of capacity to give, it may take you a while to do $20 million. But, nothing's impossible. You may have somebody just waiting to be asked. So we'll do this. Well, we went through the process, and I did say to them, they asked me the question, well, do you hear anything unusual when you do this? Well, sometimes people have a different perspective on endowment. So we often hear a number of things that are different than we would hear otherwise for a capital campaign, for example. So I was interviewing a guy who owned a bookstore and who was a member of their church and a member of the board, and he was at that meeting. So when I met with him, I said to him, sir, I said, have you thought about what you're going to do for this endowment campaign? Have you given some thought to that? And he looked at me in straight face. He said, well, I'm not going to give anything. And he said it firmly. And I said, well, is there a specific reason that I need to know about that you don't want to give? No, he said, I'll tell you, in our church, we know that the rapture is near. And I said, well, sir, forgive me, I'm just a Methodist, and you obviously have some insight that I don't have. And he said, well, I can tell you this much, Jerry. He said, you're not a member of my church, and ergo, you will not be going to heaven. I said, I got news for you. I won't be going to heaven for a whole hell of a lot of reasons, the least of which is not your church. Well, he said it forcefully back, so I just repeated it back. And he said, oh, no, Jerry, no, I don't mean to offend you anyway. I said, well, you're not going to offend me. I mean, you're entitled to your feeling and your church, and mine's a little different. That's okay. But how are we going to feed these kids in the meantime? How are we going to educate them and clothe them? Oh, he said, I'll increase my annual giving to offset that, which he did. So that was bad enough. But when I gave my report to the board and I told them that I didn't see 20 million happening very soon, that probably 2, maybe 3 million was the best they could do over the next 3 or 4 years, but that was okay because in development of endowment is an ongoing process, and ergo you can set a goal for the next 10 years and then evaluate it every couple of years. If you're doing well, raise the goal. If you're not, adjust the goal so that you achieve what you need to achieve. So the person I interviewed and was not at that meeting who had given me that response, and so he said, when we finished the report, I gave it to them, and somebody the board asked me, well, Jerry, you said when you met with us the first time that you hear some things that are unusual occasionally. Did you hear anything among our supporters that you would count that? I said, well, I looked around, he wasn't there. So I said, well, as a matter of fact, I would tell you this. One person did say to me that because the rapture was near, he would not be supporting this. When I said that, I counted them. 3 other board members said, I hadn't thought about that. And I thought, oh my word, I've just ruined this campaign right out of the gate just because of that. But anyway, things happen to you that are always there. There is for many years, had an office in Australia, offices in Australia. We probably for a decade, we worked there. And the first job I had there was the Royal Children's Hospital in Brisbane, Australia. And one of the people that they asked me to interview was a Japanese businessman who had moved there because he had a child that was needing some surgery and some other issues, and he couldn't get the care he said in Japan, so he wanted to get it there in Australia, the Children's Hospital. Great hospital, by the way. So I met with him. I asked the staff, do I need to take a translator? Is he going to, can he speak English? And they said, we're sure he does, but he will have a translator for you. You won't need to take one with you. So I got to the meeting. He had purchased a golf course right on the Gold Coast of Australia. And if you've never been to Australia or you have been, you may know that the Gold Coast is kind of like Miami Beach. It's a strand of beautiful beach and ocean, South Pacific, and lined with large hotels. So he had a golf course on there, and I met him at his office. Well, it was a very large desk, one of the largest desks I'd ever seen. and he was smoking the largest cigar I'd ever seen, actually. Not being a smoker, but it was pretty good size. So he would. He had a translator. We did we traded cards and did the formalities that one would have expected. So we did that, and then his translator came in, and she was a very pleasant young lady, and she said she would translate. So I began doing the questioning on this. Now, when you do a feasibility study, that if you've ever done one before, you would know that we don't want to ask yes or no questions. We want to ask open-ended questions, so that, as we say in the slide, conversation is important because you listen to gift. And if you listen carefully enough, emphatically, you'll know precisely the prospect's needs and greatest passions. So that's when I started asking my questions. All the questions I asked were open-ended. And so when I said to him, what do you think of Brisbane Children's Hospital? What comes to mind for you? Well, he began talking, beautiful language, all in Japanese, and he talked on for 2 or 3 minutes. And I looked at her, and she said, yes.
Okay.
And so with that, I wasn't quite sure what to do. So as we went through the interview process, it was, as I end up saying, it was one of the best interviews I never had. Or as we Methodists often say, he smiled as loud as he could open his eyes. Or so it's because we just don't do those things out loud. But it was great. It took only about 15 or 20 minutes as opposed to an hour, and he did agree to make a $10,000 gift at the end of the meeting. When I asked, she did answer that one. I have no idea what he said. She was every sentence was either yes, no, don't know. And that was it. And I would engage. So I'm not sure what the story was with him, but it was a fun afternoon for me, and I learned a lot about another culture. And next time, either speak the language or have somebody that's a translator that you take along with you to do. So it was as I said, whether you look at the cartoon, I could have sworn you said 11 steps, but it was one of those kind of things where it was fun nonetheless, and we did have a successful campaign. Now, I will say there is one on the next story is also a continuation a little bit of the Abilene Christian. We did 3 projects for them: a great institution, great leadership, and a great board. And on this particular occasion, I think this, as I recall, this study was for a $150 million campaign. And so I met with a couple who were, he was a trustee. She was, I think, actively engaged in their alumni association. Their parents and grandparents had all attended Abilene. So they were a legacy family and had been there forever. And I think, as I remember, their kids were either there in school also, or their two children, or they would be going there in any event. So I met them in their home, and in the evening, and I was seated in around a sofa, around a table, sort of a coffee table. I was on a chair on one side, and they were on each end of the table. And lovely couple, very delightful, very knowledgeable in the university, and and gave me more than a yes or no answer. Well, I got to one point, as I normally do, and said, "Have you thought about what you might consider for this capital campaign?" And in this case, I had looked at their annual giving record, and I said, I see that you're giving somewhere in the range, depending on the year, you've given anywhere from 10,000 to 25,000, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. Have you thought about what you might do for this one? And are you considering a larger gift for this? And he said, well, we've had some conversation about it, and I'm thinking we might be able to do maybe $100,000 gift for this over the length of the campaign. And she said, oh, no, we can do more than that. Well, and then they started going back and forth. And at one point he said, well, what did you have in mind? He asked his wife. And she said, I'm thinking we could do $1 million gift. And he didn't pass out, but he needed help getting out of the chair. But it was one of those moments, and I would just I fell back in my seat, just listening to it like a ping pong match, watching them go back and forth. Well, about that time, the phone rang, and he excused himself to go answer the phone. And when he did, she leaned over and tugged on my coat sleeve and said, Jerry, you'll get it, trust me. And on that, when he came back, I knew he didn't want to say anything. He didn't want to have any more of the meeting. But I said to him, "Well, thank you all. It's been great being with you." And I didn't want to have anything go further. I thought, well, we got it where we needed to get it. So I said my good night. And when I got outside the door, I looked up to the heavens and said, "Thank God he's a Methodist." Because the phone came ringing at just the right time. So that was so. As the slide says, well, why not? And I would say one of the things I learned from Jerry Pattis, my late partner and dear friend, he said in one of his books, and if at first you do succeed, try not to show your astonishment. I had to get out of there quickly before I looked so like I'd done something great. So they were just a really great couple, and I'm not sure I was not involved with the campaign. I did talk to the development officer, the VP, about it, and I'm fairly certain that they gave him a very large gift.
That's awesome.
This particular, I like this slide, and I fear this slide because it's when he says to St. Peter, "How much do you know, and how much do you just suspect?" And in my case, I'm not worried about what he knows or she knows. I'm just worried about what they suspect. So, in this case, we did a program for a Catholic hospital, and excuse me, in a small community, and a very successful hospital. And a sister was the CEO of the hospital, and she was in probably late 80s. I don't know. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes with nuns, but she was a gracious, wonderful person, and I think nearly 90, but not quite, maybe 85 to 90. But she was up there in her years. She'd been there for a long time. So when we're doing the study in the community, it was clear that she was well respected and the management was well respected. So we had nothing but compliments about her. But leaders did say to us on more than one occasion, she's done a great job, but she really, if they're going to do this large campaign and expand the hospital, does she have a succession plan? Will she be leaving? Because, she's up there in years, and it'd be about that time for her to be thinking about that anyway. I said, well, I don't know. I'll ask. So I go back and I say to the chairman of the board, we're hearing great things about the hospital, great things about management, but a lot of people know if there's a succession plan in place. He said, no, there isn't, and there needs to be, and that's why we ask you guys, because we want you to tell her. And I said, okay, I don't know if you've ever had to tell a nun something she didn't want to hear, but it's a fun experience. I offer it to you sometime. So I meet with her, and I explain to her everything, and nothing negative at all great. And then I just added, do you have a succession plan in place? She said, well, no, I don't. She said, because I think I have a lot more to give to this hospital than just getting out. I said, okay. So when I told the chairman of the board that this has, we said this is what she said. He said, well, at least you broached the subject, whether we'll take it from here. Okay, fine. So anyway, we come back, and Jerry and I are giving the report, and we're at the hospital boardroom. Typically, we would say, put us on first if it's possible on the agenda, because we had to get a flight to somewhere else that night. And in this case, there was no flight to get, so we didn't say anything about it. So we were still on the agenda early. It was not a lengthy agenda. The report to the board was the main item. So as we gave the report, and then we just sat down and listened, because the meeting was going to be over. We didn't see a point in leaving. And then the chairman of the board, who was a contemporary of Sister, and he was slightly younger than she was, but they were old friends. And he said, well, is there any new business? And no one said anything. He said, well, I have one piece of new business. Sister, you heard the report, and you heard the recommendation that we begin a succession planning process as we go forward with the campaign. And he said, so we need to think about that. And she said, well, it's interesting you bring that up. She said, I went to chapel last night, and and I prayed, and the Lord spoke to me, and the Lord said, sister, you have much more to give to the hospital. And the chairman of the board, without blinking an eye, looked at her and said, what time was that, sister? And she said, well, I'm after dinner, I think. And he said, what's about 7:30? He said, sister, I went to the chapel at 8:30, and the Lord said, sister's got to go. and you could have heard a pin drop in that boardroom, and people were just I thought, well, I've heard all of it. I've heard it all now, but he was the only one that could have said that to her, because he didn't say it with any pejorative. He just said it as a matter of fact, and she responded, well, you're probably right. Whatever the chairman's name was, I don't recall, but you're right. We ought to get started on that as soon as we can, which they did, and they did have a successful campaign. We had suggested that she stay at least through the first half of the campaign, or all of it, if they wanted. It wasn't, her management was not lacking for anything. So, but it was, I've never wanted to say that to a nun, and I'm surprised that he did. And he made this slide may be more important for him than for me, as it turns out. So, from that, from upper wherever that hospital was, I was working with a youth group in Pittsburgh, or in Swickley, PA, which is a suburb, just, I think, as I recall, west of the city, a great community, as is Pittsburgh. So we were doing an interview with a man who was a donor, and a good donor. He was, and I always ask staff, is there anything unique about this that I need to know? I mean, is there something about anybody that I should be aware of, if there's a habit or whatever? And they said to me, Jerry, this guy, don't become confused, because he will, when you ask him a question, he usually, our experience with him is that he leans back in his chair, he closes his eyes, and he thinks about it before he gives an answer. And I said, okay, fine. So he was, as I recall, maybe with a barge company. So there's an island where the rivers kind of connect in the Pittsburgh area, and his office was there. So I drove over and met with him, and I allowed usually an hour, because I have in time to get to the next appointment if I'm driving. And so when I got there, we started, and so I asked the questions I would normally ask, and he would. And she was right. He would fold his hands over his lap, and he'd lean back in this big chair, and he'd close his eyes, and he'd reflect, usually not very long, maybe 15, 20 seconds, and then he would answer. And it always very erudite answers. Well, as we got into after 15 minutes, his pauses became much longer. And so at one point, it now is 35 minutes into the interview time. I'm only on question 6. And when I went to 7, which was a question about how, as I remember, was, what do you think of their board of directors, or board of trustees? What are those people of stature and capacity, et cetera? And he had the list there in front of him, and he looked at it, and he said, let me think for a second. So he leaned back. I timed him. His eyes were closed, and he was silent for 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And I thought, I don't know if he's gone to sleep. I don't want to insult him. I was shaking him. So when finally, I said, sir, do you know them well enough to respond to that? If you don't know, that's okay too. No, I'm just thinking. And he proceeded to think again for another 30 seconds, eyes closed. So at that point, I said, I'm never going to get to the next appointment. And so I immediately kind of wrapped them all up into one and went forward. But it was the silence was not golden, because I liked it. He didn't make a gift, thankfully. I don't want to make that sound like that's obviously the feasibility study's end result is, how do we can we get some kind of idea what this person or persons might consider in giving a gift for this campaign, so that we can help determine how much we think they can raise. But we also, all the other information is critical and important as well. We need to know, are there weaknesses that need to be addressed? Are there challenges that need to be addressed? So that's why the questions become so important. So the next story I had was about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It's the SETI Institute, which is out in California, just south of San Francisco, on Landings Drive, which I always thought was good. And they were doing an endowment campaign, and I thought, well, I had watched that movie, or the TV series about the outer space and all that, and they referenced SETI a lot of times. So I kept thinking about unidentified flying objects. So but I found, when I did my research, that the SETI Institute at that time, and I suspect they still are one of the largest producers of science curriculum for high schools and colleges. They have a whole staff of PhDs and MDs and researchers, and so they wanted to do $50 million endowment campaign, and they had raised $25 million, and they had not gone public with the campaign, and they had 5 donors who had given $5 million each, including Bill Hewlett of Hewlett and Packard, and Hewlett and Packard also gave $5 million out of their foundation, as I recall, and then some of the other tech companies gave at that level as well. So they asked me to go speak with Bill Hewlett, who was at that time still working, some but retired, lived in. So I went to his home in Southern California, south of San Francisco, beautiful home up in the mountains there. And he was just a delightful man to meet, and he was impressive. So we chatted, and I asked him if he was fully retired. He said, "Well, I am not fully, but mostly." And I said, "You miss it?" He said, "No." He said, "What I miss is fly fishing. I enjoy fly fishing a lot, but I've had some issues with my legs, and so I can't stand in the water." And so he said, "I tried sitting on a bar stool, sitting in the water throwing." He said, "Can't do that. I tried holding, some sort of thing to help me stand up and do it, and it still didn't work." Well, they said, then I went to those trout fishing places, but that's like shooting fish in a barrel. You just throw it in and pull it out. He said, "There's no sport in that." So he said, "But other than that, I'm doing fine." And I said, "Well, I want to thank you on behalf of the organization for your $5 million commitment to this project. They're at $25 million, and they need to raise the other 25. And my question for you was, would you consider another $5 million gift to match what you've already given?" He said, "Well, Jerry," he said, "let me think about that for a minute." He said, but he didn't go to sleep. So he said, they do a lot. They're reaching out now with the radio telescopes that they're working with and they're researching. They can go out 10 light years, which is really impressive. He said, Hewlett Packard, there are a number of ways that research and that has other application for over the horizon radar and other kinds of things. And we figured that a $10 million investment on our behalf was a lot less money for them to do research than for us to have to research it on our own. I said, "Well, that makes sense." And he said, "So I don't know that we would do another $5 million. I'll think about it, but probably not. I wouldn't want to encourage you about it." I said, "Okay, thank you. It's very nice of you." And then he stopped me and he said, "Oh, and by the way, don't you think if they hear from somebody in outer space, their funding issues will be over?" And I said, I take your point, and you're probably exactly right. And so anyway, it was one of those. I was writing a book recently, which I'm about finished with, for my grandkids, who said to me, "We want to know about what you do and ups and downs." And so they sent me questions to answer, and one of them was about consulting and what I did in fundraising. And as I reflected on all the people that I had met over the years that are people like Mr. Hewlett and others who were either CEOs of big companies or performers, you name it. I mean, it really, I had a great interview with T. James Pickens, T. Boone Pickens, excuse me, who gave me a lot of time and gave the gift that funded the Oklahoma State stadium. So, that's just one of the benefits of what we do as development officers, when we were able to build relationships with people to do that. Now, we'll take a couple of just aside. It's not on the slides, but it was because you never know. And one with Jerry Pannis and one with me. I was doing a project up in Oregon, and met with this guy who's a CEO, and he had been migrated, his family did, from Holland after World War II, and he wrote a book on life under the Nazis at that time. And so he had this is not in the slides, and I'm just going to wing this one, and it was book was well reported, and so I and rated, and so I talked to him about it, and it was very fascinating. I said, could I get it? He said, "Would you like a copy of the book?" I said, "Yes, I would." And he said, "Well, I'll get you one after this is over." And so when we finished, he got me a copy of the book, and he said, "Now, where do we send the invoice?" And I said, oh. So I thought, and Jerry Pettis had a similar, so Jerry Pettis was a collector. If you knew him, he collected fountain pens. He was a great advocate for fountain pen use. Well, he had some fountain pens that bought were antiques, which he paid fairly high sums. And he was doing an interview in Florida with the people who was the Cross Pen Company, and the chairman or the CEO of the company was on the board of one of the institutes he was working with. And they had this conversation about fountain pens. And he said, have you seen our new Cross Super Duper fountain pen? And Jerry said, no, I haven't. And he said, well, and he said, called his assistant and said, would you get Dr. Pettis a fountain pen so he can take it with him when he goes? So they did. And he said, as he walked out at the door, he said, that'll be $26. We're just going to give it to us. So you do meet a lot of interesting people, I will say that. So I wanted the picture you're seeing now, I wanted to say a word about mentors. These are my paternal grandparents. And when I was a youngster, 5 years old, my parents were divorced. And so I lived for my sister and I until we were 10. Then we moved to the city, to Evansville, Indiana, when my parents remarried. And but I went back every summer when school was discharged. I would go back to the farm and work the farm until summer was over, and I'd come back. Well, when I turned 16, I got a car, and I needed to have a job that paid money, and my grandparents couldn't pay, so it was a hard decision to make because I cared for them so much. That was the house that they lived in, and that I grew up in, and it was and no, I'm not Abraham Lincoln, so you don't have a log cabin. But it housed 7 children all through the Depression. My grandfather built it with his own hands, and it was a warm and loving place. But they were neither one of them finished any major school. My grandmother was married when they were 16, and he went to an academy for a while. I think he graduated, it may have been a high school equivalent, because he was able to teach at the local schools a little bit. But he loved to read, and they both loved education, and they both encouraged me and my sister, and so I could not have been who I am today without their loving care and encouragement along the way. Now, I will tell you this story. When I finished my graduate work and was working full time at that university at that time, we always went down and visit them in Western Kentucky on the farm and go down and they were Southern Baptist and go to church with them. So I went down on a Sunday morning, a beautiful day, went to church with them, and as was often the custom, the pastor and his wife came home after service to have lunch with my grandparents and other family members. There was always a house full of people there. So we were sitting out under the tree in the front, not seeing this drawing, but I said to the pastor, over a glass of iced tea, sweetened, of course, I said to him, Pastor, I really appreciated your service today and your message. And I said it was about prayer, and I said I believe strongly in the power of prayer, and I appreciated what you had to say. And my grandfather said, "Well, how so, son? How so?" I said, "Well, you wouldn't know this, of course, because I don't think I ever talked to you about it. But I said when I was 8 or 9 years old, and you and grandmother and you and I, 3 of us, milked 16 cows by hand in the morning and 16 cows by hand in the afternoon and evening. And on this particular day, it was January, it was cold, snow on the ground, wind blowing through that drafty old barn, and I had to do this before I went to school. And I said, as I sat there, I leaned my head in the side of that cow, and I said, Lord God, if you're listening to me, please do not make me a farmer. And so my grandfather laughed. He said, oh, Jerry, hell. He said, I could tell you that prayer worked. I've been praying to him forever, hoping you could find something to do because you've never been a farmer. So he was, thankfully, today I own the farm, and the house is gone thanks to a couple of storms and termites, and I never rebuilt it, but we cleaned it off as a memorial and working on some things there as a park-like setting for them to be remembered and family. And so I have two aunts who are still living of that generation, and one will be 91 this next one just turned 92, and the other one will be 90. They're the only part of that generation that are still living today. Then on the Jerry Pattis is I've known for a very long time, and I put this in because, and I won't read the whole thing to you. You can read it yourself. But I thought it was particularly the last couple of sentences when he said, about halfway through, he said, you are every profession, every field of endeavor has that remarkable select band of extraordinary achievers. They pierce the heavens, uncommon temper of will, and the courage to dare. They soar as eagles, and just as eagles are born to sweep and spire into the air and into our profession, the great ones, they are born to raise. They are the inspired ones. They rule the world. They are rare breed. These inspired achievers, not yet an endangered species, but in every limited way, in a limited number indeed. He was. You can't just believe the humanness of him, the greatness of the man, and the fact that he always wanted what was best for you as a client and as a staff person. Now, I will say this. I have a picture on him, I think, somewhere in here that will be that shows him and a peek in what he was doing most, having a microphone in his hand and speaking somewhere. But I'll give you two quick stories that were funny things that happened, I thought. Steve Morning, who some of you may have known, was a great development officer, and particularly in plan giving. And he was a client of ours, and then subsequently came to work and was a partner in the firm. And he had been with us as a partner in about a year, and then he passed. He died on an airplane. They were taxiing out. He'd been in San Diego making a presentation. He lived in Little Rock, Arkansas, so he was traded. He changed planes in Phoenix, and as they rolled out to the runway, he suffered a heart attack and died. And so with the funeral, he was an Episcopalian, and the funeral was as was Jerry, and they were in Little Rock. They had the service. Well, Jerry and I both were invited to read the scripture at the service, which was well attended and full. So we're both seated in the front pew, and the pastor, Father, had been very kind to bring us a 8.5 by 11 sheet, which had the words on it, the scripture we were to read. And I was grateful because it was a little larger type. And so, Jerry, we're sitting there reading through it, and he said to me, "Do you have a pen?" I said, "Sure." "Do you have one?" He said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Oh, I forgot it. It's in my other coat." I said, "Well, here." And I handed him the pen, and he proceeded. I said, "Are you editing the Bible?" And he said, "Yes, and it'll be a damn sight better to read when I get out with it." So he was a constant editor. And so when I first went to work, my first 2 or 3 reports that I wrote, he read, I thought, but they came back all marked up in red ink. And I thought, well, it's just like being back in high school or college English class. Well, but they were good instructions. A lot of them were just comments and so on. Well, I after 2 or 3 of those, I thought, I am determined to get one of these past him without any marks on him whatsoever. So finally, it must have been on about the 5th or 6th report I had, which would have been several months into my job. I had a short timeline frame, so I didn't have time. I didn't ask him to review it, and by then I thought I knew pretty much what I needed to do. So as I wrote it, I just gave it to the office. Said, "Don't send this to him. Just send it to him when it's done." And I said, and when I presented it, I sent him the copy then. So they did. And I got a copy. I got the front page torn off, sent back to me with a big red ink. Excellent, well done. And then I realized that that if you didn't send it to him, he wasn't going to go through and do all that. And then I think the other trick he had when he would write, he always wrote something complimentary. It could always be like from the middle of the whatever it was at the end of it, never from the front. And as though he had read the whole thing. And I thought to myself, that's a neat trick if you get it. You made me think he read those reports all the way through. And I know he just looked at that page and wrote a nice thing on it and sent it back to me. So he was neat like that. And in fact, I was privileged to be one of the people that spoke at his memorial service. And he had said, excuse me, I said, Jerry, I have a library at home that has all Jerry Panis's books there, and I labeled it Greek philosophers because he was Greek ancestry, and I said, and they're all inscribed, for which I'm grateful, with a nice note inside them. And he told me forever that this was the first copy of this particular book off the publisher's run. And I said, now, how many, there were probably, I don't know, a couple of hundred people in the room. I said, how many of you have a note from Jerry Panis saying that the copy of the book is the first run? Virtually every person raised their hand. So he was attentive, he cared about people, and he was a good friend and a mentor, I'm thrilled that he was along with my life journey with me. Now, the last thing I want to tell you about is two pieces of advice. If you're looking at, you're looking at my beautiful wife, Mary. We've been married 55 years. And I have always said to development officers, treat your wife or your spouse or partner, whomever, support them and treat them like you would a major donor. Cultivate that relationship. And trust me, I would not have been married. Now, well, the other factor is I wouldn't have been married this long if I hadn't been on an airplane 30 of those years and not at home. That probably helped a little bit. But her only comment about my teaching and my career was I also taught at university, at AHP conferences, their institute at University of Wisconsin at Madison for 22 years. And I taught a class on listening the gift. And my wife said when she heard what I was doing, she said, you teaching a class on listening is an oxymoron. And that was all she ever said about it. And that was in it. Well, there may have been some truth in that at home, but I tried not to run her short in terms of time and energy and all the rest of that. So anyway, that is like something funny that happened on the way to the gift. And it was so well received by a lot of people that they asked for me to would I do a duplicate, and I have our follow up. I'm not sure what the movies I think they call it. I don't know what they call it, but anyway. So I've been going back through stuff, and I have another 20 or 30, which I might do or I might not. I've got too many other things to do right now. But if I get a feedback from Jeff that said, "Don't expect me to ask you to do this again," I'll know not to waste my time doing it.
Jerry,
anyway,
this was great. I loved it. I know our viewers, listeners will as well, and how appropriate that you'd end with Jerry Panis and your bride. So, and you mentioned mentors. Again, you've been a great friend and mentor to me for decades, and you continue to mean so much to our profession. You, like Jerry Panis, are one of those eagles and icons. So thanks to all that you have done and continue to do, and appreciate you so much for being with us again. And we will have you back when you get the next the sequel, so to speak. Then let's do it again.
Well, you're very kind, and thank you very much.
Great. To our listeners, thank you very much for joining us on this video edition of the Beacon Podcast, your connection to nonprofit success. Thanks.